May I start by congratulating my noble friend Lord Naseby on obtaining this most important and timely debate. It's many years since I visited Sri Lanka as part of an all-party delegation led by my noble friend. I'm not an expert on Sri Lankan affairs and do not pretend to speak with any authority, but simply as someone who cares for Sri Lanka and who has watched with great sadness as it's gone from being an idyllic island through indescribable horrors and now is back to the difficult process of reconciliation and rebuilding. Our visit at the time gave us the opportunity to undertake a comprehensive survey of the island at that time, and I have the most vivid memories of what we saw and the people we met. Everyone was extremely welcoming, the politicians were helpful, the tea plantations fascinating, and the landscape and the beaches were beautiful. Even the place names were entrancing: Jaffna, Kandy, Trincomalee. I recall visiting what were called the tea lines, rows of low whitewashed cottages where the tea pickers lived. We were there to study the workers' welfare and the conditions under which they lived. And I will never forget, as we got back on our coach, looking at the somewhat anxious and drawn faces of my parliamentary colleagues and comparing them with the smiling and contented faces of the tea pickers about whose welfare we were so concerned. We had, of course, a comprehensive series of political meetings and were made well aware of the dark clouds that were gathering and the reasons for them. It became even more obvious to us and a little threatening when we were warned to take great care when visiting the city of Jaffna, where the army at that time was so beleaguered that they only left their barracks to buy cigarettes and then only under armed guard. Soon after we left Colombo, there was an explosion in the hotel in which we stayed, and I think I'm right in saying that was the beginning of all the tragic events that followed and which are now only too well known by everyone. I still find it hard to imagine the people I met enduring the suffering that ensued. After such terrible times, the task of rebuilding both trust and structures is huge. Sadly, it's not new to the world. South Africa and Northern Ireland are just two examples that remind us of all that it's needed to make it work, to bring people together and to rebuild cooperation and confidence. In all this, the role of the United Nations, the subject of this debate, is very important. They must, of course, bring pressure to bear to maintain stability and move the various processes forward. These are the principal reasons for the resolutions we're debating this evening. But they must always be prepared to provide assistance and understanding, and also an acknowledgement of progress being made. It's surely right at this juncture that in taking any decision on their resolutions, the United Nations should take account of the progress to date and ask themselves what purposes their resolutions are designed to achieve. It's now 10 years since the end of the conflict, and much progress has been made. My noble friend has listed many of the advances that have been made. There is now an independent and permanent office on missing persons, been set up and is working. Parliament has passed an act to establish an office for reparations. A draft framework on the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been submitted to the Cabinet of Ministers. New counter-terrorism legislation is under consideration. 90% of state and private land used by the security forces has now been handed back for civilian use. Around 800,000 displaced people have been resettled, and Sri Lanka is due to be declared a mine-free zone in 2020. Alongside politics and the restoration of civic life, trade helps enormously to get a country back on its feet. The UK remains the second biggest market for Sri Lankan exports after the USA. We account for around 1/3 of Sri Lankan exports to the EU and are one of the major investors in Sri Lanka. Tourism, of course, plays a major role in the life and economy of the country. Sri Lanka was rated by the Lonely Planet Guide as the top destination for travellers in the coming year, 2019. And in 2017, there was a 20% increase in tourists from the United Kingdom. There was an almost 30% increase in the number of cruise ships calling at Colombo port in the first 10 months of 2018, and it is now one of the world's fastest growing ports. So, my lords, great strides have been and are being made on all fronts. And it's in the light of this progress we're asked to consider the United Nations resolutions. My lords, the Irish Times describes Sri Lanka as, and I quote, a teardrop-shaped island that's heaven on earth. In recent years, through civil war and tsunami, it's had its share of tears. The hope must be that everyone who cares for this wonderful island, including our own government and the United Nations, will do all they possibly can to help it continue on its way to a safe and prosperous future.